the arena that never forgave. She is already on her knees when the gates of the Hippodrome open, and by the time the sound reaches the highest rows, 50,000 people are standing to see her better. The midday sun hangs over Constantinople like a white blade, cutting away every shadow, leaving nowhere to hide. Stone seats rise around the arena in a perfect oval, tier after tier of faces, colors, banners, and heat, and at the center of it all kneels Helena, 23 years old, born into a blue family whose name once opened doors and now opens nothing at all. Her wrists are bound in front of her with iron, her ankles chained so tightly that standing is impossible, and the chain between them forces her into a posture that is not only painful, but deliberate, low, exposed, and unmistakably meant to be seen. The sand beneath her palms is hot enough to sting through skin, but she has been there long enough that the pain has dulled into something distant, something that feels like it belongs to another body. The noise never stops. People are not whispering. They are talking, arguing, laughing, pointing. There are no chariots on the track today, no drivers, no races. They are talking about her, guessing what she did, betting on how long she will last, trading stories that grow more detailed and more cruel with every retelling. Helena does not know what they have been told, because no one told her anything at all. There was no trial that she saw, no sentence that was read to her. There were only hands, orders, and a corridor that led downward into darkness, and then upward again into light and noise. She was told to kneel. She was told not to move. And then she was left there, alone, in the center of the largest arena in the empire. When the sound changes, she feels it before she understands it. Behind her, metal scrapes against stone, slow and heavy, and then comes the deeper noise of something much larger being moved. Voices shout commands she cannot make out. There is the clatter of hooves on solid ground, and then the dull, heavy thud of those hooves on sand. The crowd reacts instantly, as if one body, the sound rising and folding over itself, rough and excited and hungry. Helena twists as far as the chain allows, but she cannot turn fully. She can only see dust, movement, and a dark shape at the edge of her vision. Then she hears it breathe. Low, close, a bull. They are not rushing it. That is what makes it worse. The animal walks slowly, guided by handlers with ropes and poles, kept just far enough away that Helena cannot feel it yet, only hear it, only imagine it. This is not a mistake or a moment of chaos. This is staged. This is measured. The crowd begins to chant, not her name, not for mercy, but for the moment itself, for the thing they paid to see. Helena's breath comes in short, uneven bursts, her shoulders shaking, her hands trembling against the iron. She tries to think of faces in the stands, of family, of people who once shared meals with her, and wonders which of them are looking away and which are leaning forward like everyone else. She does not yet understand that this is not about killing her body. It is about killing something else first, her name, her place, the memory of who she was allowed to be. She does not know that others have already died in this arena this week, or that men in shaded imperial boxes above believe this is the safest way to rule a city. She only knows that the bull is behind her now, close enough that she can feel the heat of it, and that no one is moving to stop any of it. This is not the moment when something goes wrong. This is the moment when the system works exactly as it was designed. To understand why Helena is here, you have to understand what this place really is. The Hippodrome of Constantinople was built to look like entertainment, a vast track, towering seats, an ornate imperial box from which the emperor could watch his city cheer. On race days, it was color and noise and celebration. But beneath the sand were corridors and chambers, holding cells and hidden passages, a second world that moved people in and out without the crowd ever seeing how they arrived. The Hippodrome's not only an arena. It was infrastructure. It was a place where an emperor could look down and see his entire city gathered and measured in one space, where loyalty could be counted by colors, and where disobedience could be punished in a way no one would ever forget. And Helena is here because in this city, forgetting is sometimes the most important part of power. The city that fed on fear long before Helena was forced to her knees in the sand. The Hippodrome had learned how to swallow people without leaving marks on the surface. To most citizens of Constantinople, it was still a place of races and banners, of noise and victory songs, a place where time was measured in laps and heroes were measured in cheers. But beneath the marble and the painted symbols, another architecture existed, one that had nothing to do with sport. There were corridors that never saw sunlight, chambers that held no spectators, and doors that opened only one way. People entered these places with names. They did not always leave with them. The city around the arena had grown to depend on this hidden system. Constantinople was too large, too crowded, and too politically fragile to be ruled by law alone. It was a capital built on trade routes in old empires, filled with rivalries that went back generations, and every emperor who sat in the palace learned the same lesson sooner or later. Order did not come from being loved. It came from being seen and from being feared in exactly the right measure. The Hippodrome made that possible. When the emperor appeared in the Kathisma, high above the seats, he was not just watching races. He was watching the city watch him. He was listening to how the crowd shouted, where the anger gathered, where the silence fell. The arena was a mirror that showed power its own reflection. What most people never saw was how carefully that mirror was maintained. Beneath the sand, guards could move prisoners from one end of the complex to the other without crossing a single public corridor. A woman like Helena could be taken from a house at night, passed through a chain of rooms and stairways, and placed in the center of the arena without ever being seen by the streets she had lived on. By the time the crowd noticed her, she already belonged to the spectacle. She was no longer a citizen. She was a moment. These passages were not only for the condemned. They were also for messages. Sometimes a man would be brought out, punished, and removed again before the crowd fully understood what his crime had been. Sometimes a group would vanish, and days later their absence would be explained by a single, carefully chosen appearance in the arena. The point was never efficiency. The point was memory. The Hippodrome taught the city what to remember and what to forget. It is easy to imagine ancient punishments as acts of uncontrolled cruelty, but what made Constantinople different was how controlled everything was. The arena did not exist to satisfy anger. It existed to manage it. Every detail, the timing, the setting, the witnesses, was chosen to turn fear into something useful. A quiet execution in a prison cell did not change how a city behaved. A public ritual, watched by tens of thousands, changed everything. Above it all, in the shaded imperial box, the court could observe without being observed. From there, the emperor saw not individuals, but patterns. Which sections cheered, which stayed silent, which looked away. The Hippodrome was a census of emotion, taken in real time. And when the numbers looked dangerous, when one faction grew too confident or another too angry, the arena provided ways to remind everyone where the limits were. Helena's presence in the sand was not an accident or a sudden decision. It was the visible end of a long, invisible process. Somewhere, someone had decided that her family's name needed to lose its weight, that her face needed to become a lesson. The crowd did not need to know the details. They only needed to see the result. And they did not need to be told what to feel. Fear is contagious in large spaces. It moves faster than reason, and once it takes hold, it becomes a kind of agreement, a shared understanding that certain questions should not be asked. The Hippodrome was built to host that agreement. It was a place where the city came to be entertained and left having been instructed. By the time the bull was led behind Helena, the lesson was already working. Even before anything happened, people were learning what it meant to be small in a very large empire. And somewhere beneath their feet, in the dark corridors that never slept, the next names were already being moved into position. The factions that owned the streets in Constantinople, no one was ever just a citizen. Long before they learned the names of emperors, children learned the colors. Blue or green, the words were spoken in homes, painted on walls, stitched into clothing, and carried like inheritance. What had begun centuries earlier as nothing more than racing teams had grown into something far more dangerous. By the time Helena was born, the factions were not entertainment. They were identities. On race days, the division looked almost harmless. The Hippodrome split itself into two great halves, each side a sea of color and noise. Songs were sung, insults were traded, and victories were celebrated as if they were personal. But away from the track, the blues and the greens had their own leaders, their own meeting halls, their own ways of enforcing loyalty. They could gather crowds in hours. They could empty streets just as quickly. And when they fought, they did not fight like sports fans. They fought like militias. Emperors learned to fear them and to use them at the same time. Promise one side favors, ignore the other. Change a law, appoint a bishop, raise a tax, and watch how the colors react. The factions became a kind of political instrument, a way to test decisions before they were made, and to punish enemies without appearing to do so directly. When violence broke out, it was always easy to blame the crowd. For families like Helena's, being blue was not a choice. It was history. It meant certain allies, certain expectations, and certain protections, as long as the balance held. But balance in Constantinople was never stable. It shifted with every rumor, every sermon, every change in the palace. A family that was safe one year could become useful the next, and in this city, being useful often meant being sacrificed in a very public way. The Hippodrome was where these invisible tensions became visible. The emperor did not need spies in every house when he could look down from his box and see where loyalty sat. If one side cheered too loudly or too confidently, it was noticed. If another fell silent, that was noticed too. The arena turned emotions into something that could be counted. Helena's arrest did not begin with a crime. It began with a moment. A rumor about her family. A shift in favor. A need to remind one side of the city that their position was not as secure as they believed. The exact story would have changed depending on who told it. That was the point. In a city ruled by factions, truth was less important than usefulness. Once a name had been chosen, the process was efficient. Guards did not need to explain themselves. Orders did not need to be written down. Everyone involved understood the language of necessity. A woman could be taken from her home, and by the next day become a symbol, not of what she had done, but of what others were meant to fear. The crowd in the Hippodrome did not see this machinery. They saw only the surface. A young noblewoman in chains, an animal being led into position, an emperor watching from above. But they brought their own knowledge with them. They knew that today it was Helena. Tomorrow it could be someone else's daughter or sister or patron. The factions taught people to think in terms of sides, but the arena taught them something deeper, that no side was ever truly safe. And yet they still came. They always came, because to stay away was to be noticed, and in Constantinople, being noticed in the wrong way was more dangerous than almost anything else. As the blues and greens shouted across the sand, as the noise rolled back and forth like surf against stone, Helena remained where she was, small and silent at the center of a conflict far larger than her. She did not know which decision, which whisper, which political calculation had placed her there. She only knew that the city was watching. What she could not know was that the factions, the arena, and the palace were all moving toward something much larger than her alone. The system that had chosen her was about to choose thousands. And when it did, the Hippodrome would no longer be able to pretend it was only a place of games. The punishments Rome would not use. The Roman world had always understood spectacle, But even in a civilization built on public execution, there were limits that were rarely crossed. In older centuries, death in the arena was meant to be fast, or at least final. It ended a life, and with it, the story. What Byzantium inherited from Rome, and then quietly transformed, was something far more precise. Here, the goal was not only to end a body, but to unmake a person while everyone watched. In Constantinople, punishment had become a ritual language. Every method carried meaning. Chains were not just restraints, they were announcements. Postures were not chosen for convenience, they were chosen for humiliation. The length of time a victim was left waiting mattered as much as what eventually happened to them. Fear worked best, the city had learned, when it was given time to grow. Some of these punishments were never written into law. They existed in practice, in precedent, in the shared understanding between the palace and the crowd. A person could be kept alive and conscious long enough for the audience to grow restless. They could be displayed in a way that stripped them not only of dignity, but of identity. Sometimes they were forced to listen to their own accusations, read aloud, accusations that changed with each telling. Sometimes they were made to kneel for hours before anything else happened, long enough that the waiting itself became the main event. Foreign visitors noticed this difference. Even Romans, whose ancestors had filled amphitheaters with blood, wrote with unease about the careful cruelty of the eastern capital. It was not the violence that disturbed him, but the control. In Constantinople, nothing about punishment was accidental. It was designed to be remembered. Helena's position in the sand was part of that design. She was not placed there simply to be killed. She was placed there to be seen, and to be seen for long enough that her face would stay in the minds of those who watched. The bull behind her was not only a weapon. It was a symbol of power, of inevitability, of the distance between a human body and the forces that could be brought against it. In some cases, the animal never even had to touch the condemned. The threat was often enough. The crowd would carry the image home, tell it to others, and the lesson would spread faster than any decree. In other cases, the arena would go further. A punishment might be staged in phases, each one more degrading than the last, each one giving the victim another chance to break in public. What made these rituals effective was not only fear, but uncertainty. No one in the crowd could be entirely sure how far it would go. The rules were never fully explained. That was intentional. When people do not know where the line is, they stay far away from it. The Hippodrome had become a place where law blurred into theater. Officially, the empire was ruled by codes and courts. In reality, everyone knew that some decisions were made somewhere else, and that the arena was where those decisions became visible. A person might disappear into the system, and weeks later reappear for a single unforgettable afternoon. The palace understood something simple and dangerous, that public suffering could do what armies sometimes could not. It could quiet a city. It could turn anger into caution. It could remind factions, families, and officials alike that their positions were temporary and that protection was conditional. As Helena waited, with the heat pressing down and the crowd's noise washing over her, she was already part of this language. Whether she lived or died was almost secondary. What mattered was that everyone present would remember the shape of her in chains, the way she knelt, the way the arena held its breath around her. And somewhere beneath the sand, in those same corridors that had carried her into the light, other preparations were already being made. Because the system that had refined these punishments was not built for one woman. It was built for a city. And soon, the city itself would be placed on display. The day the crowd became a weapon for years, the Hippodrome had been used to measure the mood of Constantinople. On one side, the blues. On the other, the greens. Between them, the emperor, watching, counting, adjusting. Most of the time, the system worked. Anger was released in chants instead of riots. Revelries were kept loud but contained. The arena acted like a valve, letting pressure escape before it could split the city apart. In the winter of 532, that valve failed. It did not begin with revolution. It began the way so many disasters do in Constantinople, with an arrest and a rumor. 2 men, one blue and one green, were condemned for murder after a riot. They were supposed to die in the usual way, quickly and publicly, and the city would move on. But the execution went wrong. The ropes broke. Both men survived the first attempt. In another time, they would have been taken away and finished in private. Instead, they fled and found refuge in a nearby church. The crowd noticed. For once, blue and green were not shouting at each other. They were shouting the same word. Nika. Win. It began as a demand for mercy. It turned into something else almost immediately. The Hippodrome, which had been built to divide the city into manageable halves, suddenly became a place of unity, and unity in Constantinople was far more dangerous than rivalry. When Emperor Justinian appeared in his box, he did not see 2 factions. He saw one crowd. What followed was not a riot. It was a week of fire. The city burned. Palaces, markets, churches, entire districts were destroyed. The old order vanished in smoke, and for a moment it seemed as if the empire itself might vanish with it. The rebels proclaimed a new emperor. Officials hid or were killed. The streets belonged to whoever could hold them for a few hours at a time. And at the center of it all stood the Hippodrome. The same arena that had been used to control the city became the place where the city gathered to overthrow control. Tens of thousands of people filled the seats, not to watch, but to decide the future. The emperor's position was suddenly uncertain. His advisors told him to flee. His ships were ready. The empire could be abandoned and rebuilt somewhere safer. It was Empress Theodora who refused. Her words were not recorded in detail, but their meaning survived. Better to die as rulers than to live as exiles. Justinian stayed, and the system that had been built to intimidate individuals was about to be used against the crowd itself. The generals Belisarius and Mundus moved their troops into position quietly, through the same kinds of hidden passages that had once moved prisoners. When the signal came, they closed the exits and advanced from opposite sides. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The crowd had come unarmed. They had come to shout and to choose a new emperor. They did not come to fight disciplined soldiers in an enclosed space. By the time it was over, the sand of the Hippodrome was no longer visible. Ancient sources speak of 30,000 dead. Some say more. The arena that had taught the city fear had now taught it something else, that the crowd itself could be punished. After that day, the Hippodrome was never the same. The factions survived, but they were quieter. The city survived, but it was changed. The lesson was understood without needing to be repeated. And Helena, wherever she was in that moment, belonged to this same story. The same machinery that could erase a woman in chains could also erase an army of citizens in a single afternoon. The arena had always been a place of messages. On that day, the message was written large enough for an entire empire to read. And it would not be the last time. The truth buried under the sand centuries later, the Hippodrome of Constantinople is quiet. The races are gone. The banners are gone. Even the empire that built it is gone. Tourists walk where emperors once sat, and the ground where tens of thousands once shouted is crossed in silence. Very little remains that can explain what this place was really for. And yet, the stones remember. Modern historians did not begin by looking for cruelty. They were looking for structure. They studied old building plans, fragments of chronicles, half-burned records from monasteries and palaces, and they began to notice something that earlier generations had missed. The Hippodrome was not only a stadium. It was connected to prisons, to guard barracks, to administrative buildings, to the palace itself. It was not built just to host crowds. It was built to process them. Beneath the surface, in the same dark passages that once carried prisoners like Helena, the empire had created a system that could move people, ideas, and fear with equal efficiency. Punishment was not a reaction. It was a policy. This is the part history rarely likes to admit. The cruelty of Byzantium was not chaotic. It was organized. It was measured. And that is what made it effective for so long. When a city knows that anyone can be chosen, and that the choice will be made in public, people begin to control themselves long before soldiers need to. The story of Helena survives only in fragments. A name in a list. A passing reference in a later chronicle. No one recorded exactly what happened to her in the end. That absence is not an accident. The system did not need her death to be remembered. It needed the moment before it, the image of her kneeling, the animal behind her, the crowd watching. That was the lesson. Most of the people who witnessed that day went home and never spoke of it in detail, not because they had forgotten, but because they had understood. Silence was safer. After the Nika Revolt, the Hippodrome continued to function, but the message had been perfected. The arena was no longer only a place where individuals were broken. It was a reminder of what could happen to everyone at once. The crowd had been taught that it was not just a witness to power. It was also a target. Over time, the rituals became less frequent, then different, then finally unnecessary. An empire does not need to repeat a lesson forever once it has been learned deeply enough. Fear, once planted, does much of the work on its own. What remains today are stones and stories, and a question that historians still argue about. Was Byzantium unusually cruel, or was it simply more honest about how power really works? Every state needs ways to make itself visible. Some build monuments, some build armies. Byzantium built a stage. The Hippodrome was that stage. It showed people who they were, where they stood, and what they could lose. It turned politics into theater and punishment into ritual. It taught a city to watch itself. And somewhere, buried under centuries of dust and rebuilding, is the sand that once held the shape of bodies, human and animal, victim and executioner, crowd and ruler. The shapes are gone. The lesson remains. Because the most disturbing part of this story is not that Helena was placed in the arena. It is that tens of thousands of ordinary people came to watch, and that an empire learned it could rule not only by laws and armies, but by carefully choosing what its people were made to see.